Good afternoon and welcome to our FBF online debate on securitization. My name is Pierre Schlosser. I'm the scientific coordinator of the Florence School of Banking and Finance. And it's a real pleasure to be welcoming you all to today's online debate. You will see that the format is a bit different. We'll have different speakers. It will be a bit shorter during the time of day. What will we discuss today? Well, we'll talk about securitization, as you could see. It was on everyone's lips in the years 2007 and 2008 at the very start of the global financial crisis. Securitization then again came up on the agenda a few years later when new EU regulations were adopted to make it more transparent, amongst others. Ever since, European issuance levels have remained quite low, in particular compared to the US, which, among others, asks the question of the future of securitization in Europe. Now, to discuss this today, I'm very glad to be in the company of Professor Bart Joosen, our moderator, Simon Broxham from Duver Consulting, and Richard Hopkin from the Association for Financial Markets in Europe, who are all great experts in the field and who will enlighten us all. As always, let me thank my colleague Jan for the preparation of the online debate. Before entering in the merit of today's discussion, let me first inform you about our school's upcoming activities in really just a few minutes. I'll try to be very short. As some of you already know, we at the school have many residential training courses in our pipeline. You will see on the slide who typically attends them. You will see that there is a mix between central bankers, financial stability experts, banking regulators, and supervisors. And altogether, since the school's creation in 2016, we have trained more than 2,500 participants from more than 65 countries. Clearly, you can find more details on all our activities on our website, but let me just flag 3 courses which could be of interest to you, 3 that are coming up in March. Next month, indeed, we'll have residential courses on monetary policy transmission, where we will look at banks, non-banks, credit and prudential policies, together with Carlo Altavilla from the European Central Bank and José Luis Pedro from Imperial College London. Then later in March, we'll have a course on liquidity regulation, practice and stress testing with Professor Christos Gortsos, as well as practitioners from the SSM, practitioners also from industry. And then later on in April, we'll have a macroeconomic course with Nobu Kiyotaki, still on liquidity, looking at public policies and constraints. But perhaps even more importantly, as some of you could see in the video, we are very glad to announce that in mid-May, we'll host a 2 weeks online course on securitization. The course will be directed by Professor Bart Joosen, who is with us today, and has been designed by my colleague Jan Trevisan. The course will involve experts from both the public and the private sector in its faculty and will consist of self-paced video lectures and podcasts, interactive discussions, quizzes, case studies, and live lessons. So if you're interested to learn more about the course, stay tuned. Jan will provide you with more details at the very end of this online debate. Right, so let's start again and start with you this time. Thank you for your patience. You're about 60, 70 actually participants today. 35 nationalities are represented. We're very glad that several participants from, again, the public and the private sector are here today with us, and academia is, of course, also represented. Gender-wise, we have 42% of women and 58% of men. You have about 9 years of professional experience on average. And this time, 48% of you are trained economists, 28% are trained lawyers, but we do also have other profiles which we highly value. Lastly, 72% of you have a master's degree, while 21% of you have a PhD, and 7% have a bachelor degree. So that is actually to give you a picture of who's in the room, since you can't see each other, and also to give the opportunity to the speakers to understand in more concrete terms to whom they're talking. Let me stop here because it's time to start with the debate. With no further ado, let me hand over to Bart Joosen, who will guide us through today's topic and will launch our debate. So Bart, let me hand over. I see that the presentation is uploading, and we see you. Good to see you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pierre, for the kind introduction. Today I would like to briefly touch upon the new securitization regulation that is now applicable for more than 1 year, and where we had the first experience with this new overhauled type of regulation concerning the securitization transactions in Europe. Let me just first highlight the motives of the European Commission to enact and to propose, in the context of the Capital Markets Union, the securitization regulation, which was proposed in 2015 and then subject to quite elaborate negotiations between the European legislators. The overall objective of the Commission of this legislative package was to remove the stigma attached to securitizations, to remove regulatory disadvantages for simple, transparent and standardized securitization products, and reduce or eliminate unduly high operational costs for the issuers and for the investors. And the other objective of the securitization regulation was to introduce a clear distinction between simple, transparent and standardized securitizations and those transactions that do not qualify as STS. This particular distinction is also relevant in order to allow banks and insurance companies to obtain capital relief when they invest in STS securitizations. The resulting securitization framework would ultimately be more risk sensitive and better balanced. Preferential capital requirements would then incentivize banks and insurers to invest in those products, and investors would be encouraged to re-enter the securitization market, which was, after the financial crisis 2007 and 2008, as alluded by Pierre, indeed facing a very severe decline, certainly compared to the United States. Now, in its nature, the securitization regulation contained also a consolidation, if you like, of the rules that were enacted since 2009 for the various types of financial undertakings. In 2009, we introduced the new rules for credit institutions, and that was followed by rules for the AFME managers, UCITS managers, and ultimately also effective the 1st of January 2016 for insurers and reinsurers. Now, these separate and sectoral rules were then consolidated in the securitization regulation, and these rules basically address firstly and continue to require from banks and the other regulated financial undertakings to ensure basically that the originator or the original lender would retain a certain portion of risk of the securitized assets, to impose due diligence requirements, to impose transparency requirements on the issuers or originators, and to ensure that the underwriting criteria of securitized assets are in accordance with a homogeneous application of policies. And furthermore, so this is the first part of the securitization regulation, and consolidating existing rules into one overall cross-sectoral part of the securitization regulation. The second part of the securitization regulation introduces the qualification of the transactions as STS in accordance with a model that was developed by the European Banking Authority back in 2015, in which the EBA basically endorsed certain principles that were developed by the Basel Committee to support the simple, standardized and transparent securitizations by introducing a number of principles. Now, it would take too long basically to discuss all those various requirements separately, but based on this particular model, the ultimate text of the securitization regulation was shaped and requires transactions or asset-backed commercial paper programs to meet those requirements in order to qualify as an STS securitization. Now, to take it further, in this approach, basically, the first phase basically introduces criteria to monitor that no additional complexity is introduced in the transactions, that the transactions should be simple, understandable, and clear for the investors in securitization paper, with no black boxes of complicated structures underlying the various transaction or to the underlying transaction structure. And secondly, the criteria for STS securitizations also aim at excluding risky assets to be comprised in the portfolio of assets to be securitized in order to ensure that the portfolio transferred in the transaction meets certain criteria and does that on an overall portfolio level without individual assets deviating from the portfolio profile as contributed in the securitization transaction. The securitization regulation applies both to individual transactions but also to asset-backed commercial paper programs. These programs seem to develop nicely in Europe, so there is some room to observe that the securitization regulation has not restricted the further development of these programs, which are particularly relevant for the refinancing of SME portfolios generated by smaller issuers, if you like, or smaller originators. We have no rules yet given for the STS qualification of synthetic securitizations, for example, credit default swaps, but EBA launched its consultation paper on STS criteria mid-October 2019. Thus far, commercial mortgage-backed securitizations are not considered to be qualifying as an STS, removing, if you like, or driving the STS framework to only comprise assets that are perceived to be non-complex and more easy to structure, whereas a CMBS transaction would typically result in more difficulty and more complexity, if you like, for cash flows and other parameters basically relevant for the transaction. In its nature, one of the debates that were held in European Parliament when negotiating the securitization regulation was the suitability of this product also for the retail markets. And what we do see in the securitization regulation, certain strict rules for the offering of these products to the retail clients of, for instance, portfolio managers. Furthermore, in order to avoid the complexity of securitization transactions, what is not permitted is to include in its nature securities, for instance, bonds issued by certain issuers to repackage these securities in a securitization transaction. We have 1 year's experience, as I told in my first introduction. And we do see basically that many, if not most, of the new transactions are structured to fit into the STS criteria, and few constraints arose, had to adapt to those new rules, particularly for the RMBS, the residential mortgage-backed securitization market. But also we did see a lot of activity in the car lease area, where a number of transactions have been launched qualifying as an STS transaction fairly recently in the last year. Because of the consistent application of the STS transaction type, the market is indeed experiencing a quick learning curve how to adapt the existing structures or legacy structures basically to the new criteria. And what we also do see is quite some activity where legacy transactions are transformed in order to make them qualifying as an STS transaction. There is a considerable backlog in implementing the technical standards that have been adopted quite in an early stage by both ESMA and by EBA. Currently, as of today, we still are awaiting the final publication of the technical standards for disclosures and STS notifications. There is still some backlog with respect to the asset-backed commercial paper and synthetic securitizations, as I just highlighted. Currently, we do not have a authorized securitization repository, so there are still things to do, and the framework and the legislative framework is still not complete. What we also saw in practice is that the new prospectus regime that became effective July 2019 gave some considerable additional complication for public transactions, where the new prospectus regulation rules needed to be fitted into the prospectus to be issued and to be approved by the authorities in the context of a launch of a new securitization transaction. I must say, in an independent way, that we currently do see some constraints with respect to the coordination by the supervisory authorities, and that is particularly relevant for the coordination by the domestic authorities that are involved in the event, for instance, securitization would annex to various jurisdictions. For instance, the originator is established in one member state, and the SPV or the special securitization purpose entity is established in another jurisdiction, and it's particularly there that in practice we do see some constraints. What we also observe is that market participants demonstrated more agility to adapt the new rules than currently is the case for the public authorities. So I would leave it to this as a first introduction, and to give you a bit of a highlight of the topics that we also aim to address in more elaborate and extensive way in the forthcoming masterclass on securitization. And I hand over the presentation to the next speaker, please.
Very good. Thanks a lot, Bart. So if I may just ask Richard to connect to the platform.
All right. So I'm Richard Hopkin. I'm head of fixed income at the Association for Financial Markets in Europe. We are based in London, Brussels, and Frankfurt. And our job is to represent the interests of the banks in the European market in terms of financial regulation. We cover all kinds of subjects, but my particular focus is on securitization, and I've worked on the securitization regulatory reform for pretty much most of the last 10 years now. Professor Joosen, I think, gave us a very good introduction there, and he he is right that securitization for many years, probably up until about 2014, from the financial crisis in 2008 until about 2014, had a bad reputation. It had a stigma. But as I'll go on to show you, that stigma was largely, if not entirely, attributable to excesses in the United States subprime mortgage market. When you look at European securitization, it has in fact performed extremely well. But anyway, let me begin just by setting the context a little bit. And I really can't do better than quote the chairman of BNP Paribas, who was speaking at Eurofie, which is a big financial conference that takes place twice a year with lots of regulators, lots of financial institutions attending. And you can see there that he makes the point that Europe's banks are struggling at the moment. There are many challenges with bank profitability. Higher capital requirements, monetary policy is not helping bank profitability at the moment. And indeed, capital requirements are only going in one direction, which is up. We have a new capital regime coming into force gradually over the coming years. It's referred to in shorthand here as Basel IV. But essentially what that is going to do is increase the amount of regulatory capital that banks have to hold on their balance sheets to carry on or to lend to their clients, whether their clients be customers for residential mortgages or companies, small or large, or whatever. And so capital is a cost for banks. It's a sort of an input into the manufacturing process, if you like. So if capital becomes more expensive, securitization can play a really important role because securitization does two main things. First of all, it does raise finance, so it's a form of raising cash from new investors that perhaps you wouldn't be able to reach from other means that banks have to raise money. But also, and most importantly in this context, securitization also enables banks to manage their capital on their balance sheets, because essentially what it does is transfer risk off the balance sheet to investors in the capital markets, thereby freeing up the risk that's associated with those assets when they were held on the balance sheet and enabling the bank to lend more. So securitization isn't a way of raising new capital, but think of it as a way of recycling capital or enabling banks to use their capital more efficiently. And that's why it's key in Europe, particularly facing the higher capital requirements that are on the way, that we get a better functioning securitization market back. The United States is doing extremely well with its securitization market. Europe is lagging a little bit behind. So just turning to the next slide. This is just a summary of issuance in Europe. It's called European placed issuance. That means bonds placed with investors. And you can see that in 2007 it was a very hot market, over 400 billion euros of issuance, and then a big drop, 2008, 2009. And then since 2014, 2015, you can see that's when the stigma started to dissipate. And you can see we've seen a slow increase in securitization placed issuance over the last 5 years to 2018. Now, these figures take us up to the end of the third quarter, 2019. We don't have quite yet at AFME our full figures, but others have reported figures, and unfortunately it looks like the full year figures for 2019 are going to be a little bit down on 2018. That's largely because we had almost no issuance at all in the first quarter. This was due to the delay in the adoption of some of the secondary legislation that Professor Joosen referred to in his opening remarks. But this gives you a flavour of what kind of market we're in. But, you know, essentially bumping along at about 100 billion euros of issuance a year is okay, but could be a lot better. In better news, this is a breakdown of the STS issues made to date. actually to mid-January, I beg your pardon. These figures are easily available at the ESMA website. The link is there at the bottom. But you can see that the good news is that around 150 or so transactions have adopted this new STS label, simple, transparent and standardized securitization. It's not easy to qualify for that label. There are many, many requirements. It's a very, very tough thing to qualify for, but I think the market has by and large done a good job in embracing these regulations. And there's a good both by asset class and by country, as you can see, in terms of usage of the label. So that is an encouraging sign. The next couple of slides just serve, I think, to do away or essentially give you or show some evidence about the strong performance of securitization in Europe. As I said at the beginning of my remarks, the reason for all this very, very tough regulation of securitization, and indeed securitization regulation was described just last Thursday by Christian Moore of the European Banking Authority at a conference I attended as best in class, which is I think high praise coming from a very prudent banking regulator. But these regulations are very tough, and that was because of what happened largely in the United States market. And as you can see here, this in contrast shows statistics gathered by Fitch, the rating agency, who published a very interesting report in May of last year, which I think is available publicly. If you Google, you'll probably find it. And what this shows is that the losses really that have affected securitization regulation were incurred in the years leading up to the financial crisis. These losses are actually, in terms of quantum, much lower than what happened in the United States, but there were some losses in Europe. And you can see here that they were largely concentrated in commercial mortgage-backed securities, which, again, as Professor Joosen mentioned, typically do not qualify for STS labeling. Structured credit, which is essentially collateralized debt obligations or securities that are repackaged and then issued as new securities. And again, they are outside the remit of STS securitization, and a bit of residential mortgage-backed securities losses. But you can see that after 2007, those numbers have fallen to almost zero. In fact, you can barely see the numbers there. This is very interesting because it is a vintage analysis. It's looking at each cohort by year of origination, and you can see that essentially for the last more than 10 years now, the performance has really been excellent because the regulations in Europe were put in place very, very quickly. And that's one reason. There are other reasons as well that I don't have time to go into. But so essentially, it's a very strong story of performance. And my last slide just looks again in a little bit more detail at the loss history. And there again, you can see that looking at it by asset class rather than by year, and this looks at the issuances across 18 years from 2000 to 2018, the losses that were suffered were largely in commercial mortgage-backed securities, structured credit, and a bit incurred in residential mortgage-backed securities, largely from before the regulations were tightened up. Those slides just give you a little bit of a flavour of the context. Perhaps I should leave it there because I know there are other speakers and we need to allow some time for questions at the end as well. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Richard. That was very helpful, I think, to give us an overview and also hang through the policy debate also in history. So let me invite Simon to join in.
Thanks, Pierre. I'm Simon Broxham. I've got
Perhaps give
over
a
25
more
years
practical
experience as
side
a
to the
portfolio
story, and then
manager
we'll
and
complement to
trader
put things in
specializing
perspective.
in credit,
Simon, the floor is
securitization,
yours.
and interest rate markets. I'm currently working as a consultant on change and control issues in wholesale markets. I thought we would just spend a very short period of time just going through what a portfolio manager is trying to achieve, which is basically to generate a positive return on the capital that you've been given to manage. You've got some positive cash flows in there, which come from the sale or redemption of assets, and also from dividends and interest payments that you receive during the time that you own those assets. And on the negative cash flow side, you've got the purchase of the assets at the beginning, and you've got any write-downs that you might take due to default or bankruptcy. And in debt portfolios, which obviously include securitizations, your basic objectives are to maximize the interest receipts and to minimize losses due to defaults. Just a quick reminder there. And I think also it's kind of useful to think about why a portfolio manager might want securitizations within their portfolio. What they do is give you very specific exposures, which are quite difficult to get in an isolated format. For instance, you can get direct exposure to residential mortgages, for example, auto leases, and also credit card receivables. The only other way you might get those is by going out and buying some senior unsecured debts from a building society or a bank, but you then get a load of other stuff as well. It also gives you investment at a very defined level in the capital structure for that asset. And in other words, you know how much subordination or how much loss the structure can absorb before you start making a loss on the part of the transaction that you own. And you don't really get that via any other asset class. And thirdly, you get some very specific reporting, which is specific to the portfolio that you've invested in. And again, if you go and buy a bank bond, you don't get that information at that level of detail. And you've got a well-defined loss mechanism. And all of those are quite attractive. Quick history, which we've already been over once or twice. I won't dwell on it too much, but the securitization market started in the mid 1980s. It grew through the 1990s, but from kind of 2003, 2004 onwards, there was a very strong inflow of money into the market. Returns were squeezed, and as often happens in such markets, you get a search for assets to fulfill the demand, and also for yield from the investors. And it kind of puts you in a situation where you have some undesirable consequences. You get what happened was you ended up with some assets of portfolios of reduced quality. You ended up with poor information about those assets and inconsistent information between different transactions. You had people who organizations that set themselves up, basically originating assets purely to distribute them. They didn't retain any interest in those economic interest in those assets afterwards, and arguably didn't really care that much about them. You also had resecuritizations, or some also known as CDO squared, which I think are a really difficult asset class, a really poor asset class. We can talk about that later if anyone wants to. You also ended up with very compressed timelines for investors to look at what they were buying, and arguably also for the and the rating agencies were also being squeezed from all sides to go through their processes very quickly. And all in all, you ended up with some pretty poor investment decisions being made. 2008, there was obviously a financial crisis, and 2009 onwards, the securitization market kind of collapsed for a significant period of time, particularly out of Europe, as Richard mentioned a few minutes ago. Yeah, the spreads were kind of too high to make the market work very well, using securitization as a funding vehicle. It was a tainted asset class for many investors as well, wrongly so, particularly if you look at Richard's charts. There was securitization going on in Europe, but a lot of it was really to produce collateral to post at the ECB to participate in their funding mechanisms. And as also been mentioned before, US issuance did continue during this period. Things have got better from 2014 onwards. Risk retention rules made a big difference, and again, if you look back to Richard's charts, you will notice that when risk retention was brought in 2014, issuance started to increase. We can talk perhaps later on about whether we think 5% is the right amount for an originator to retain. STS introduced from 2019, which gives a number of positives. It gives better reporting. It gives a standardized and easier to understand format, and I think in general it will have a very positive effect on the asset class. We should also remember that there are non-STS securitizations coexisting, and I believe that market can and should continue. Resecuritization has been banned under the regulations. Good thing, in my opinion. New issuance, the proportion of new issuance that is distributed is going up, which is good, and we're getting increasing diversification of issuers and also of asset classes. Secondary market is still illiquid, basically, and that's due to a lack of supply. And when activity happens in the secondary market, it's usually done via bid lists, which mean that the seller will publish a list of what he wants to sell a couple of days in advance. That will be circulated via securities dealers to potential buyers, and they will come in with a bid. And effectively, it'll be a secondary market auction. It works fine, but it would be nice to have some more supply and some more liquidity. What might happen in the future? I think there are probably some other classes that should be considered for STS. My personal opinion is that there should be a way to make CMBS acceptable, but again, we might want to talk about that later on. CLOs, I think are a valid class. I think we've got adoption of risk-free rates, which is a big issue. In other words, transition away from LIBOR and into other rates. That has been something of a hold-up for, I believe, over the last year or so, and we might want to talk about that later. And ESG securitization in particular, and the E or green securitizations, I believe will continue to grow. I think we'll leave it there, and perhaps we can continue a discussion later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. I think you provided us also with a very good market perspective on both on the short and the long view. So I would invite now everyone back on stage. So if Richard, Simon, and Bart, you could reconnect and connect your camera and your microphone, we could start the debate, and we will then, in a very almost immediate step, ensure that everyone can then join the conversation through the chat box that our seminar participants will know about. Welcome also to Jean-Jacques Van Helden, who is on camera and who is a visiting fellow at the Schumann Center, and who will also share his views. Maybe over to Bart for now, and again, I invite all participants to think of the few questions that you had in mind. As you could see, this was, I think, a very good patchwork of views currently on securitization informed by, I think, the past 2 decades. Bart, the floor is yours.
Yes, so you can hear me now.
Yes.
So we have a brief overview, albeit it's of course a complex area. Still, the securitization regulation, particularly with respect to STS, aims at creating simple structures, but if one is working in practice, then even an SDS securitization still has its complexity. So, but still, I do see, and we have seen that in the figures of Richard, and also in the overview that Simon gave, is that there is quite some potential for the market to regain strength, perhaps not at the levels of 2007 and before, but still. We think it should be interesting to see how the market is coping with further developments in the forthcoming years. So I'm just waiting for the further questions, Pierre, or would you like me to go and interact with the other speakers at this stage?
So if you had one question that you wanted to ask to our speakers, we could first prioritize this and then go back to the chat box.
Yeah. Okay, Simon. One question for you. You ended your presentation with had a potential for ESG securitizations, or asset class, if you like. What do you think is going to be necessary in order to make sure that that market is going to pick up, and where transactions with ESG assets will be a asset category that can be used in securitization transactions?
I think there is going to. I think there's going to be a demand from investors for. And from the end investors for ESG securitizations. I think ultimately there is going to be a regulatory requirement for more ESG products, and I think really it's going to come from the demand side. I think there's an increasing awareness of climate issues. I think people are really going to want to focus their assets in things in green securitizations, for example. It's not too difficult. You have to have certification as you go through the process. But there are a number of organisations that are already doing that, and I think it's a business that an area of our industry that will continue to grow. I don't know, Richard, maybe do you have something to add?
Yes, I think you're right. I think most of the demand for green finance of all kinds, not just securitization, is going to be investor driven, and I think it boils down to a question of taxonomy. The European Commission has been doing a lot of work looking at taxonomy for finance, green finance generally. There hasn't been much issuance of green securitization as yet, but at AFME we have published a short paper on principles for green securitization, where we set out how we think a market for green securitization could best be set up. That paper is available on our website, afme.eu, if anybody would like to go and take a look at it. But I think it's certainly a market that's going to grow in the future.
Can I just put a question to both Richard and Simon, if I may? It's Jean-Jacques here. CMBS are currently in the naughty corner, and I'm just, in terms of the asset classes applicable and for securitization going forward, Richard first, what needs to happen for CMBS to come back out of the naughty corner and be traded as an acceptable asset class within securitization? And then the second question, I guess also directed to you, is going back to one of your slides. You saw this performance of, I think it was the third or fourth slide, a sudden drop-off in terms of defaults and the like. And you mentioned there was a number of other reasons why that was the case. You didn't want to go into that at the time, which I appreciate, but perhaps you could elaborate on that and give some background as to that quite dramatic, I think personally, visually dramatic slide in terms of that part of your presentation.
Sure. Sorry, what was the first question again? CMBS. CMBS, right. Well, there's actually nothing to stop an appropriately structured CMBS qualifying for the STS label under the current regulation. The regulation does not prescribe what qualifies as STS by its name, by whether it's CMBS or RMBS or autos or whatever else it might be. It sets out sort of broader principles. So now the reason that CMBS transactions typically don't qualify for STS is mainly because they don't meet the simple requirement. Now, simple perhaps would be best restated as simpler, but the concept behind simple is that the variables in the transaction should be defined. So they should be known unknowns. So you should know when you analyze a securitization, for example, that you look at the historical default rate, you make assumptions about that, about delinquencies, about interest rate rises, and so on. The challenge CMBS has is that they are often, not always, but often, not what we call full payout financings. So, there might be a loan secured on an office building, and the loan is for 5 years, but at the end of the loan, the refinancing for that loan either comes from a new transaction in the capital markets or a sale of the property. Now, the problem is there's a lot of volatility in the price at which you could sell the property, and it's very unpredictable. So unlike and the other factor, of course, is granularity, which is often lacking in CMBS transactions. So it's really for those reasons that CMBS typically, but not by definition, typically don't qualify for STS. And the Commission at the time did think very, very carefully about this, also for CLOs for different reasons. So, there is no animus against CMBS per se. If you can meet the requirements of STS, then for example, if you had a big portfolio, and if it was a full payout CMBS and so on, there's nothing to stop you getting the label. But it is difficult because of how CMBS are typically structured. Now, sorry, just quickly, because time is going on. Your second question, I think, was about one of the last slides showing the
Could we
the sharp fall in defaults. Is that right?
The timing is really of the essence. We've received many questions in the chat box. I would just prioritize those questions now, and then eventually go back to the second question of Jean-Jacques. So I can see that there's strong interest on several aspects which you've partly touched on. Let's isolate maybe two. One is securitization and resolution, which I think came up in two questions. And the second is the CLO market. So I don't know, Bart, maybe you could distribute the questions. You've worked on resolution, I know. So perhaps the question on securitization and resolution goes to you, and then we'll ask our other fellow speakers to engage with CLO and then go back to the initial questions. We apologize for the delays. We're running late, but we will make sure that we close the seminar in about 5 to 10 minutes, so 5:05 maximum. Thank you.
Yes.
Bart, over to you.
Let me just quickly, if I may, Pierre, just touch upon the question on the resolution. I think securitization as a transaction type for a bank that is in resolution is probably not going to be suitable. But what we can see and say about securitization in the context of a bank that is in need for restructuring or is anticipating, for instance, that there might be pressure on liquidity, is that what we do see is basically that securitizations are used, for instance, to prepare the bank to have liquidity lines available. For instance, an internal securitization being set up to create sufficient collateral for a lending facility to be provided by the ECB. That is something which is often done in practice, where you do see that banks are then using a part of their assets to create an internal and not a public securitization to make those assets eligible as collateral for an ECB credit line if that's going to be needed in times of, if you like, liquidity distress. But I do not think that in view of the need to prepare these transactions, they usually take a couple of months before you can launch them, that they would be suitable for a restructuring in the first days of a resolution taking place. Perhaps, Pierre, if I may suggest a CLO question to be passed on to Simon, because I think I'm sure that he would have some ideas on that.
Yeah, CLOs. I guess there are CLOs. I might defer to Richard here actually, but CLOs, they're sort of difficult to get as much information about as possible to make them fit within the STS regulation. You can get the granularity without too much difficulty, but providing the history and the homogeneity of assets might actually be quite difficult. So I think actually they probably normally fall outside the STS regulation, but Richard, you might want to comment quickly as well.
Yes, they typically do not qualify for STS, but again, it's a question of meeting the requirements rather than just per se being CLOs. The main reason they don't qualify is because the performance of the CLO is dependent on the skill or otherwise of the CLO manager, which is one of those unknown unknowns, and therefore makes the transaction not be simple or simple enough to qualify for the STS label. And again, that was an issue that was argued extensively at the time, and the Commission was, very firmly of the view that the STS label was not appropriate for CLOs, and I don't think that view is going to change, to be honest.
Okay. Well, I'm looking at the watch, and I would just suggest that we stop the debate here, but we don't stop the discussion, because as our participants know, the discussion will go on as part of the online course. And let me invite first, thank you all for the contributions and the great questions. And let me just invite Jan on stage, who will tell us a bit more about the scope and the features of the course. And then we will train finish what they have to finish today. Thanks a lot for that contributions to Richard, Jean-Jacques, Simon, and Bart. Again, Jan will close up.
Thank you also from my side for your presentation, and thank you, Pierre, for giving me the floor. So, as you all know now, we do have this online course on securitization, regulation, and practice, which is going to happen from the 8th of May to the 22nd of May. This course will be targeted at introductory to intermediate level, so this might fit exactly those of you who ranked your knowledge about securitization at 3 out of 4 into the introductory box at the beginning of this online seminar. And in this course, we will start by giving the basic definition of securitization, highlighting different types of assets, discussing the historical evolution as well as the current trends, and then we will move on towards discussing how securitization is regulated in Europe, as well as a snapshot on what is going on currently in the US. Then we'll go a little bit more into the details of how to manage securitization on your balance sheets, placing them on the market, and managing the risks which may arise. Then we'll discuss how to deal with the prudential framework for securitization, and we'll include also a case study on liquidity. And finally, we'll see also how securitization can be used by small and medium enterprises, how it can be used to rid of non-performing loans, and what you can learn from some case studies in this area. And finally, how securitization can promote green economic products and sustainable finance. So green securitization, which came up as a topic here, is definitely going to be covered into this online course. In this journey, we'll be guided by a panel of expert instructors, which include some persons whom you already see here on screen. So obviously we have Bart Joosen as the course director. Simon Broxham will be leading the module on how to look at securitization from the balance sheet. And Jean-Jacques, who we'll see here on screen, will be moderating the live classes. But this is not all. We'll have also contributions into this online course by other people, including, for example, Anna Bach, Associate Director in the Securitization Division at AFME, but also experts from ESMA, from the EBA, and experts from the public and private sector in general. So this course will start, as I said, on the 8th of May, but the platform will be open 24/7. You can access the material at your own pace, and over the course of the 2 weeks that the course will last, you'll have access to recorded lectures as well as podcasts and voiceovers. You'll take part in quizzes and exercises and participate in discussion forums together with other expert instructors and the other participants, and attend live classes, which are a little bit like this format that we just had, but obviously we'll go into the details of single specific modules. So there is space for interaction, there is space for debate, and obviously there is space for learning. So if you want to learn more on the topic of securitization, applications are now open. For the first pilot edition, we'll have limited seats, so please do not wait too long to apply. And having said that, I will just type in here the link for the masterclass webpage on our website. So if you want to have some more information, feel free to reach out to us, to the team, as well as obviously to consult this webpage. Once more, thank you so much to all our speakers. It was really a pleasure having you here, and I look forward to seeing you speakers and you all participants in our upcoming occasions in which we'll discuss securitization here at the Florence School of Banking and Finance. Thank you very much. Have a good rest of the afternoon, and until next time, goodbye.